My husband walked away from 10 years of marriage to protect a daughter who was destroying him. But when he finally broke down, crying behind a closed door, my deep resentment melted into something I never expected to feel. My name is Sarah Miller. I am 34 years old, and I am a senior forensic compliance auditor for a regional bank in Columbus, Ohio. I hunt missing money for a living. I follow the paper trails that people pray will stay buried. I know exactly how a lie looks when it is hiding inside a spreadsheet. So when my husband slid a fabricated IRS form across our granite kitchen island and asked me to sign my own professional death warrant, he forgot exactly who he was married to. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The rain was hitting the kitchen window in a steady rhythm, but the house was completely silent. My husband David was 46 years old. He owned a highly lucrative medical supply distribution company. He was a man who usually wore his confidence like a tailored suit. He walked into rooms expecting people to listen. But that night he was sweating. He smelled like stale coffee and nervous energy. He placed a manila folder on the island between us. He did not look me in the eye when he opened it. He pulled out a stack of tax documents, specifically a 1099 and a modified Schedule C. He pushed a silver pen across the granite until it stopped an inch from my hand. He told me there was a discrepancy. That was the word he used. Discrepancy. It is a clean, corporate word designed to make bad things sound like innocent mistakes. The discrepancy was for $150,000. I looked down at the paperwork. I did not need to read it twice to understand what I was looking at. The numbers were entirely fabricated. The vendor payouts listed did not exist. The losses claimed were entirely fictitious. I looked back up at him. I asked him where the money went. David rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the floor. He looked at the window. He looked everywhere except at my face. Then he admitted the truth. His 22-year-old daughter from his first marriage, Chloe, had taken it. She had access to the company accounts to run what David called basic administrative tasks. She had embezzled $150,000 over the course of 8 months to cover a series of catastrophic investments and a lifestyle she could not afford. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the island. He told me the IRS was auditing the company. He told me that if they found out Chloe took the money, it would be classified as federal wire fraud. She would face prison time. Then he tapped the silver pen. He asked me to sign the forms as the primary preparer. He wanted me to claim that the missing money was a clerical error on my part, an accounting oversight. He spoke quickly, his voice tight with desperation. He said that because I had a spotless professional record, because I was a licensed compliance auditor, the investigators would simply believe it was a mistake. I would face a fine. I might lose my license, but I would not go to jail. Chloe would be safe. I stood there in my own kitchen listening to the man I had built a life with ask me to destroy myself for a girl who had never once treated me with basic human respect. I did not shout. I did not throw the pen at him. I placed my hands on the cool granite counter. I told him I could not sign the document. I kept my voice perfectly level. I explained the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I explained federal compliance laws. I told him that my fiduciary duty and my professional license were not bargaining chips to be used to cover up his daughter's felony. David stared at me. For 3 full seconds, the nervous sweating man disappeared. The corporate patriarch returned. His panic hardened instantly into a cold, blind rage. His face turned dark red. He slammed his fist down on the paperwork so hard, the coffee mugs rattled on the counter. "She is my blood, Sarah!" He shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "If you will not protect this family, you are not part of it." Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the truth does not shout. It just waits for its turn to speak. Drop your city and local time in the comments below, and hit subscribe if you have ever been asked to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. David did not wait for me to process his ultimatum. He turned on his heel and marched up the stairs. A few minutes later, I heard the heavy, unmistakable thud of suitcases being dragged across the hardwood floor of our bedroom. He was packing my bags. I walked into the living room and stood by the fireplace. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a slow, heavy rhythm. I could hear David pulling clothes from hangers. When he came back downstairs, he bypassed me entirely. He went straight to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon. The sharp, smoky smell of the alcohol filled the room immediately. He drank it fast, aggressively, punishing the ice cubes in the glass. I stood there and watched him. I did not cry. I did not beg him to stop. Because as I listened to him drag my luggage toward the front door, I realized this moment had been building for 10 years. It was just a slow burn that finally reached the powder keg. Chloe was 12 when David and I got married. From the very beginning, David shielded her from every consequence the world tried to hand her. When she was 17, she totaled her brand new Audi because she was texting while driving. She hit a parked car. David arrived on the scene with his checkbook and quietly paid off the other driver to prevent a police report from going on her record. When she was 19, she was placed on academic probation at her private university for paying another student to write her final papers. The dean called David. David flew out the next morning, made a substantial donation to the university discretionary fund, and the academic probation quietly vanished. Through all of this, I was the invisible support system. I managed the household budget. I balanced David's personal accounts. I reminded him when Chloe's tuition was due. I organized his tax files so his accountants could do their jobs. I was treated like a highly efficient free administrative assistant. When Chloe demanded a luxury vacation for spring break, the money appeared. When I suggested we upgrade the software for his supply chain logistics, I was told we needed to watch our spending. David loved my competence when it served his life. He relied on my ability to keep his world organized and legally compliant. But the moment my competence became a mirror reflecting his daughter's profound failures, I became the enemy. I became disposable. David walked back into the living room. He set his empty bourbon glass on the coffee table. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with manufactured righteous anger. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He held it out to me. "These are the divorce papers," he said. His voice was clipped and entirely devoid of the decade we had spent together. "My lawyers drafted them. You can review them with your own counsel, but you need to be out of this house tonight." I looked at the envelope. I did not take it from his hand. I let him hold it in the air until his arm lowered and he dropped it onto the glass coffee table. I did not say a single word. I walked past him to the front closet. I took my work laptop from my briefcase. I walked over to the pile of luggage he had haphazardly thrown together. I picked up one single suitcase containing my essential clothes. I went to the small safe in the hallway and retrieved the only thing in this house that truly mattered to me, my grandmother's pearl necklace. I walked to the kitchen island. I took my house keys off my key ring. I set them down right next to the fabricated IRS forms. The metal clinked against the granite. I walked out the front door into the rain. I put my suitcase in the trunk of my car. I sat in the driver's seat and I gripped the steering wheel. The leather was cold against my palms. I did not start the engine right away. My mind, the mind of a forensic auditor trained to spot patterns and anomalies, was already working faster than my grief. David had handed me divorce papers. They were fully drafted thick with legal clauses and property divisions. Divorce papers do not magically appear in a suit jacket on a Tuesday evening. They take weeks to draft. They take meetings. They take deliberate quiet planning behind closed doors. David had known he was going to divorce me long before he asked me to sign that tax form. He had planned to kick me out. The request to commit federal perjury was just the final test. If I signed it, he would have leverage to keep me quiet during the divorce. When I refused, he simply accelerated the timeline. But there was something else. A glaring, massive red flag waving in the center of my brain. He packed my bags with frantic speed. He wanted me out of the house tonight. He was desperate to separate me from his company files, from the home network, from anything that would allow me to look deeper into his finances. $150,000 is a lot of money. But for a medical supply distribution company valued in the tens of millions, it is a rounding error. It is a solvable problem. It does not warrant an emergency cover-up. It does not warrant handing your wife a fabricated tax document and throwing her onto the street in the middle of a rainstorm, unless the $150,000 was not the actual problem. I started the engine. The windshield wipers swept the rain away in a steady, rhythmic motion. My husband thought he was discarding a useless wife who refused to play along with his family's secrets. He thought he had severed my access and protected his daughter. He was completely wrong. As I drove away from the house I had lived in for a decade, I realized that David's haste to get rid of me was the greatest mistake he had ever made, because the missing money was just a leak, and I was about to find the crack in the dam. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city. The space smelled strongly of fresh latex paint and industrial carpet cleaner. It was small, it was isolated, it was absolutely perfect. I did not post a tearful status update on social media. I did not call my girlfriends to drink wine and complain about my broken marriage. I bought a heavy folding table, a comfortable ergonomic chair, and I set up my dual monitors against the blank living room wall. When you hunt missing money for a living, you learn very quickly that silence is your most valuable asset. People who are lying expect you to scream. They expect you to demand answers and throw tantrums. When you go completely dark, they assume you have surrendered. They get careless. They leave their doors unlocked. I booted up my laptop. I poured a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee. I sat down and went to work. David had rushed me out of our home to sever my access to his physical filing cabinets. But we had been married for 10 years. My name was still listed on the joint banking accounts. More importantly, I still had my administrative security tokens for his medical supply company portal. He had not instructed his IT department to revoke my credentials yet. Arrogance always breeds this specific kind of oversight. He believed I was just a heartbroken housewife crying in a hotel room. I started my trace with the $150,000 discrepancy. The fabricated IRS document he wanted me to sign claimed the money was lost to a series of vendor payouts that went sideways. I pulled the general ledger from the cloud server. I isolated the routing numbers for those specific undocumented vendors. I ran them through a standard federal tracing database. The money had not gone to medical suppliers in the Midwest. It had been wired in highly structured incremental batches to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. People often think shell companies are invisible shields. They are not. They are just incredibly tedious puzzles to unravel. And I have an exceptional threshold for tedium. I pulled the public incorporation filings for that specific Delaware entity. I tracked the registered agent. I cross-referenced the mailing address with public property records. The managing director of the shell company was not a stranger. It was Thomas. Thomas was David's younger brother. He was 44 years old. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life bouncing between failed startup ideas and begging David to cover his massive financial losses. I sat back in my chair. The harsh blue glow of the dual monitors illuminated the dark apartment. Chloe did not steal that money to fund a bad personal investment. She funneled it directly to her uncle. They were working together, but something bothered my professional instincts. $150,000 was simply not enough money to justify the level of federal risk they were taking. It was far too small a prize for a coordinated embezzlement scheme between a daughter and an uncle. Fraud is exactly like a termite infestation. If you see one bug walking across the kitchen counter, there is a massive nest chewing through the walls. I expanded my search parameters. I bypassed the daily operating accounts and went straight to the company's capital asset ledger. I looked at David's commercial warehouses. He owned 3 massive distribution centers, free and clear. They were the undisputed crown jewels of his logistics empire. I pulled the uniform commercial code filings from the county public database. My screen immediately populated with a brand new document filed just 3 weeks ago. It was a commercial lien. A major bank had approved a $3 million revolving line of credit using David's commercial warehouses as the primary collateral. I downloaded the loan origination documents. I zoomed in heavily on the signature page. The borrower listed was the medical supply company. The authorized signatory was David. But I had been married to the man for a decade. I had seen him sign thousands of checks, vendor contracts, and birthday cards. I knew the exact angle, pressure, and slant of his pen stroke. The signature on the $3 million loan was a very impressive forgery, but it was absolutely a forgery. The secondary authorizing signature belonged to Chloe acting in her official capacity as an administrative officer. The funds from the massive loan had been entirely diverted into the exact same Delaware shell company controlled by Thomas. The truth crystallized in my mind with terrifying absolute clarity. David had thrown his loyal wife out into a rainstorm to protect his daughter from a minor embezzlement charge. He thought he was playing the role of the fierce protective father. He had no idea that his precious daughter and his own brother had just stolen $3 million and legally framed him for federal bank fraud. When the bank eventually realized the loan was in default, the FBI would review the paperwork. They would see David's forged signature. David was going to federal prison, and he had just actively destroyed the only person competent enough to save him. I did not feel sorry for him. I felt an absolute ice-cold focus. I took digital screenshots of every single loan document. I saved the files to an encrypted external drive. But I knew digital files were not enough. I needed the original copies. I needed the undeniable proof. It was a Tuesday morning. I needed to leave the apartment to clear my head. I walked 3 blocks to a local independent coffee shop. The morning air was sharp and cold, smelling faintly of wet pavement and roasted espresso beans. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a small scarred wooden table near the back window. I had a thick stack of printed ledger summaries in front of me. I always prefer to review certain financial anomalies on physical paper. You can spot hidden patterns in the margins much faster when you hold the raw ink in your hands. I was running a red pen down a long column of rooting numbers when the chair across from me scraped aggressively against the hardwood floor. I did not look up immediately. I deliberately finished underlining a highly suspicious vendor payment. I capped my red pen. Then I slowly raised my eyes. Thomas sat down heavily. He wore a sharp, expensive suit that did not quite fit his frame. He smelled of cheap, overpowering cologne and the distinct sour odor of stale cigarettes. He smiled at me. It was the exact same arrogant, dismissive smile his older brother wore when he wanted to make someone feel small. I did not flinch. I did not ask him how he managed to find me. When you ping internal banking portals and pull highly secure corporate documents, the system automatically generates security alerts to the account administrators. Chloe was the primary network administrator. She had seen my digital footprints across the server. She had panicked and sent her partner in crime to handle the situation. Thomas leaned forward across the small table. He invaded my personal space, trying a textbook intimidation tactic to establish physical dominance. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the scratched wood until it bumped hard against my coffee cup. He told me it was a very generous settlement offer. He said David wanted to make this divorce process quick, quiet, and completely painless for everyone involved. He tapped the thick envelope with his index finger. He said there was a certified cashier's check inside for $50,000. All I had to do was sign the attached non-disclosure agreement and the expedited divorce papers. The non-disclosure agreement explicitly stated I would permanently waive my right to any financial discovery. It legally bound me to never review, audit, or discuss the operational finances of the medical supply company ever again. "Take the money, Sarah," he said. His voice was thickly patronizing, dripping with manufactured sympathy. "Go start over somewhere else. David wants you gone. If you try to drag this out through the family courts, his corporate lawyers will happily drown you in legal fees until you have absolutely nothing left." I looked down at the envelope. I looked back up at Thomas. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I picked up my mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. It was scalding hot and perfectly bitter. I pushed the envelope back to the exact center of the table. I told him I was not interested in his $50,000. Thomas let out a short, harsh laugh. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He told me I was drastically overplaying a weak hand. He called me a glorified calculator who got incredibly lucky by marrying into a wealthy, successful family. I kept my hands resting lightly on the printed ledgers. I spoke to him in short, precise sentences. I told him that I knew all about the Delaware Limited Liability Company. I recited the exact banking routing numbers entirely from memory. I watched his confident, arrogant smile waver just a tiny fraction of an inch. Then I told him I knew about the $3 million revolving line of credit. I told him I knew he and Chloe had forged David's signature to secure the commercial lien against the warehouses. Thomas froze completely. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The fake patronizing warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by naked panic. I did not stop talking. I maintained unbroken predatory eye contact. I calmly explained the text of Title 18 United States Code Section 1343. I detailed the exact legal definition of federal wire fraud. I explained the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for defrauding a major financial institution. Then I explained Title 18, Section 1512, witness intimidation. I pointed my red pen at the non-disclosure agreement sitting between us. I told him that sliding a financial bribe across a table to a licensed federal auditor to conceal a multi-million-dollar felony was a textbook undeniable violation of the law. Thomas's breathing grew ragged and shallow. His eyes darted frantically around the busy coffee shop, suddenly utterly paranoid that a stranger at the next table was listening to our conversation. The arrogant man who had sat down 3 minutes ago was entirely gone. He was replaced by a cornered, terrified amateur who realized he had just picked a fight with an apex predator. "You do not know what you are talking about," he hissed. His voice was trembling violently. "You have absolutely no proof. You are just a bitter, discarded ex-wife trying to cause trouble because my brother threw you out on the street." I smiled at him. A very small, very cold smile. I told him that forensic auditors do not need to cause trouble. The numbers cause the trouble. We just walk into the dark rooms and turn on the lights. Thomas lost his temper completely. He stood up so fast and with so much force that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the floor. Several people in the coffee shop turned around to stare at us. The barista paused abruptly behind the hissing espresso machine. Thomas leaned far over the table, his face just inches from mine, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched. "You are going to walk away from this family with absolutely nothing," he whispered, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. "We will ruin your life. You will never work in this state again." He turned sharply and stormed out of the coffee shop. The brass bell above the glass door jingled aggressively as he yanked it open and disappeared into the gray street. I did not tremble. I did not panic. I reached across the table and picked up the thick manila envelope. I slid it carefully into my leather tote bag. Thomas had thought he was delivering a terrifying threat. He had actually just hand-delivered a signed, documented attempt to conceal a major federal felony. It was a beautiful, priceless piece of leverage. But I knew Thomas was right about one critical detail. Digital audit trails and computer screenshots were a solid starting point, but they could easily be contested by expensive defense attorneys in a courtroom. Chloe could simply claim her administrative computer was hacked by a malicious third party. Thomas could claim the Delaware Shell Company was legally set up for a legitimate real estate venture. If I was going to drop the hammer on this toxic family and expose their rotting foundation, I needed the physical, undeniable proof. I needed the original notarized loan documents containing the forged signatures. I needed the certified bank records stamped directly by the county clerk. I gathered my printed ledgers and my empty coffee cup. The conflict was no longer just about a painful divorce. It had rapidly escalated into a high-stakes, dangerous race. Thomas and Chloe knew exactly what I was doing. They would immediately try to cover their digital tracks. They would try to destroy the physical evidence. I needed to strike first, and I needed to strike with overwhelming, absolute force. The rain from the night before had left the Columbus streets slick and gray. I did not go back to the coffee shop. I drove directly to the Franklin County Courthouse. It is a massive limestone building that smells permanently of industrial floor wax and nervous sweat. I knew exactly where to go. 5 years ago, I audited municipal bonds for the city. I still knew the senior clerk in the commercial property division. Her name was Evelyn. I walked up to her counter. I did not ask for a favor that would cost her a job or bend the law. I simply asked her to expedite a routine public records request. I handed her a slip of paper with the exact parcel numbers for David's 3 distribution warehouses. I paid the $40 processing fee in cash. 12 minutes later, I walked out of the heavy double glass doors holding certified, stamped copies of his commercial liens. The paper was thick and still warm from the industrial printer. The county notary stamp was a raised, undeniable seal pressed deeply into the corner of the pages. It was the physical anchor I needed to ground my digital evidence. I drove to a local office supply store. I walked down the quiet, brightly lit aisles and purchased a heavy navy blue 3-ring binder. I bought a pack of clear plastic sheet protectors. I bought sticky tabs and a brand new red pen. The cashier scanned my items with absolute boredom. She had no idea she was ringing up the exact instruments of a corporate execution. I returned to my quiet one-bedroom apartment. I cleared off the folding table I was using as a dining space. I laid out the certified courthouse documents. Then I opened my laptop and went to work on the digital side. When you share a cell phone plan with your spouse for 10 years, you have full, unrestricted legal access to the account records. I logged into our primary cellular provider portal. I pulled the detailed message logs for Chloe and Thomas. They were incredibly sloppy. Arrogance always breeds severe technical incompetence. They had not used encrypted messaging applications. They had simply texted each other using standard cellular data. I downloaded the transcripts in their entirety. I began the physical assembly. The heavy metallic click of the binder rings opening and closing echoed in the empty room. It is a very satisfying sound. I used my red pen to label the first tab. Tab 1 was dedicated strictly to the forged signatures. I placed the certified courthouse loan origination documents inside the plastic sleeves. I printed out a dozen separate, legitimate contracts David had signed over the past year. I highlighted the precise discrepancies in pen pressure and slant. The forgery was good, but placed side by side with the genuine articles an amateur could see the hesitation in the fake signature. I labeled the second tab. Tab 2 held the digital tracking network. I printed the IP addresses of the offshore transfers. I printed the Delaware Shell Company and Corporation records, listing Thomas as the sole managing director. I matched the exact timestamps of the wire transfers to Chloe's secure login credentials at the medical supply company. The money moved from the commercial line of credit to the operating account, and then directly into Thomas's pocket. It was a straight, undeniable line. Then I labeled the third tab. Tab 3 contained the text message logs. I printed them on bright white paper. I sat in my ergonomic chair and read the exact words my stepdaughter and my brother-in-law had exchanged. They were laughing. They were mocking David's absolute blindness. Chloe had texted Thomas on a Tuesday afternoon, complaining about her mounting credit card debt. Thomas had replied that the gullible old man would happily take the fall while they cashed out the equity. Chloe responded with a laughing emoji and typed that David was too busy yelling at me about household grocery expenses to ever check the capital asset ledgers. I placed the transcripts into the binder. I snapped the metal ring shut for the final time. The binder was thick. It was heavy. It possessed a physical gravity that perfectly matched the magnitude of their crimes. I ran my hand over the smooth navy blue cover. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the time you take to let your opponent build their own trap. When people realize you are not screaming or fighting back, they assume they have won. They stop checking their perimeter. They relax. They send careless text messages and forge federal documents because they truly believe no one is watching. I was watching. I had always been watching. The following morning, my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of my divorce attorney, Rachel. I had retained her services 3 days after David threw me out of our home. Rachel was sharp, pragmatic, and completely devoid of unnecessary emotion. We spoke the exact same language. I answered the call. Rachel bypassed small talk entirely. She told me David's high-priced legal team had officially requested a formal recorded mediation. They wanted to skip the standard discovery phase and move directly to a binding settlement. They had booked a private conference room at their downtown law firm for the following Friday. "They are trying to crush you with speed," Rachel said. Her voice was clipped and highly professional. They sent over a preliminary email outlining their terms. "It is incredibly aggressive, Sarah. I have never seen a firm push a settlement this hard and this fast, unless they are hiding massive liabilities." I asked her to read me the email. Rachel cleared her throat. The email was drafted by David's lead counsel, a man named Sterling. It was dripping with unearned hubris. Sterling wrote that his client David was prepared to be exceedingly generous despite my sudden and unprovoked abandonment of the marriage. However, this generosity was strictly conditional. The email stated that I must sign a formal administrative confession regarding the missing $150,000. If I accepted the blame for the clerical error, David would graciously allow me to keep my own retirement accounts and my personal vehicle. If I refused, Sterling wrote David was fully prepared to litigate the divorce until I was completely destitute. He threatened to go after my professional pension. He threatened to saddle me with his corporate legal fees. He explicitly stated that I would walk away with absolutely nothing but a ruined reputation and a mountain of debt. I listened to Rachel read the threats. I did not feel a spike of panic. I felt a deep, resonating calm. They were doubling down. David actually believed he held all the cards. He was using his expensive legal attack dogs to terrify me into signing a confession for his daughter's crime. He thought the threat of financial ruin would break my spirit. "What do you want to do?" Rachel asked. She sounded ready for a massive fight. "I can file an immediate injunction. We can drag them through a forensic accounting discovery phase that will take 2 years. We can force them to open every single book they have." I looked at the navy blue binder resting on my folding table. I did not need 2 years. I did not need a team of aggressive corporate lawyers battling over subpoenas. I already had the entire story sitting in front of me, perfectly categorized and indexed with a red pen. "Tell them we accept the mediation," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "Tell them I agree to meet this Friday." Rachel hesitated. The line was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, if we walk into that room without requesting our own financial discovery first, they are going to try to steamroll you. They are setting up a slaughter." "I know exactly what they are setting up," I replied. "Tell them I will be there. But you do not need to prepare a massive defense strategy, Rachel. I just need you to secure my seat at the table. I will handle the division of assets." I hung up the phone. I stood up and walked over to my closet. I needed to select my wardrobe for Friday. When you are married to a man who values appearances above all else, you learn that clothing is armor. I bypassed the soft sweaters and pastel blouses David had always preferred me to wear. I pulled out a tailored charcoal gray suit. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black leather pumps. It was not the outfit of an obedient, discarded wife. It was the uniform of a senior federal auditor. The next 48 hours moved with agonizing slowness. I did not pace my apartment. I did not practice emotional speeches in the bathroom mirror. I simply reviewed the navy blue binder. I memorized every date, every routing number, every forged signature stroke. I knew the timeline better than the people who had actually committed the crime. David and his lawyers believed they had engineered the perfect ambush. They had booked the expensive glass-walled conference room. They had drafted the intimidating threats. They had positioned Chloe to play the tragic innocent victim. They assumed I would walk into that room shaking with fear, overwhelmed by their power and their wealth, and sign away my life to avoid their wrath. They had absolutely no idea that they had just scheduled their own corporate execution. I packed the heavy binder into my structured leather briefcase. I snapped the brass locks shut. The collision between David's blinding arrogance and my absolute undeniable receipts was going to be completely devastating. And I was entirely ready to watch his empire fall. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime, revealing the 40th floor of the most prestigious corporate law firm in downtown Columbus. The reception area was a vast expanse of white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray skyline. The air up here smelled distinctly of lemon furniture polish, bitter espresso, and the kind of quiet, insulated power that assumes it can buy its way out of any consequence. I stepped onto the thick carpet wearing my charcoal gray suit. My divorce attorney Rachel was waiting for me near a massive abstract painting. She carried a sleek silver briefcase and wore an expression of absolute calculated neutrality. We did not exchange pleasantries. We did not need to. We simply nodded to each other and followed a paralegal down a long, silent corridor. We were led into a sprawling conference room. The walls were entirely made of soundproof glass. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by heavy ergonomic leather chairs. David was already seated at the head of the table. He wore a dark navy suit, but it hung slightly looser on his frame than it had 3 weeks ago. The skin around his eyes looked bruised with exhaustion, deeply lined and weathered by the stress of his hidden financial crisis. Yet his posture remained rigidly defiant. He sat with his shoulders squared and his hands folded, resting on the polished wood. He was desperately clinging to the persona of the untouchable corporate patriarch. To his immediate right sat his daughter. Chloe had completely abandoned her usual wardrobe of designer crop tops and heavy makeup. Today, she was performing the role of the tragic innocent victim. She wore a modest pale pink cashmere sweater buttoned to her collarbone. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, neat clasp. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand, dabbing at her dry eyes with practiced rhythmic precision. Flanking them were two aggressive corporate defense attorneys. The lead counsel, a man named Sterling, wore a custom-tailored suit and a patronizing razor-thin smile. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at a very small, very compliant lamb. He had no idea he was sitting across from a wolf. Rachel and I took our seats on the opposite side of the mahogany table. I placed my structured leather briefcase on the floor directly next to my right foot. I folded my hands on the table, mirroring my husband's posture, but lacking his desperate tension. I was perfectly, entirely calm. Sterling did not waste time with introductions. He leaned forward, rested his forearms on the table, and launched his opening salvo. His voice was incredibly smooth, dripping with the kind of practiced condescension that male lawyers often use when they assume they are speaking to an uneducated housewife. He began by lecturing me on the severity of federal tax discrepancies. He used highly technical financial jargon, deliberately attempting to confuse and intimidate me. He spoke about administrative liability. He threw around words like criminal negligence and asset forfeiture. He painted a terrifying fictitious picture of my imminent legal destruction. Then he slid a crisp, heavily stapled document across the polished wood. It stopped exactly halfway across the table. Sterling explained that his client was prepared to offer an exceedingly generous resolution. The document was a formal administrative confession. If I signed it, taking full unconditional legal responsibility for the missing $150,000, David would gracefully decline to press civil charges. But there was a catch, Sterling added, his smile widening slightly. Because of the extreme financial damage my supposed negligence had caused the medical supply company, I would have to forfeit any claim to alimony. I would have to surrender my equity in the marital home. I would walk away with my personal vehicle, my individual retirement account, and absolutely nothing else. Sterling leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He adjusted his silk tie. He told me that if I refused this incredibly fair offer, they would drag me through a brutal litigation process. He promised to freeze my assets. He promised to contact the federal banking regulators and have my forensic auditing license permanently revoked. He explicitly stated that they would ensure I was left entirely destitute. Chloe let out a soft, highly theatrical whimper. She pressed the tissue to her nose and looked at her father with wide, doe-like eyes. David finally broke his silence. He leaned forward, his face twisting into an expression of cold, absolute contempt. He looked at me not as the woman who had managed his home and his sanity for a decade, but as a stubborn obstacle standing between him and his daughter's salvation. "Just sign it, Sarah," he demanded. His voice was hard and completely devoid of empathy. "You brought this on yourself when you abandoned this family." I looked at the man I had married. I looked at the daughter who had despised me. I looked at the high-priced lawyers who thought they had just cornered a terrified victim. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for the pen lying next to the confession document. Instead, I gave them exactly what they had given me for 10 years. I gave them silence. I sat perfectly still and let the quiet stretch across the massive conference room. I let it stretch for a full 5 minutes. If you have ever negotiated with arrogant, aggressive people, you know that silence is their absolute worst enemy. They use volume and speed to control the room. When you refuse to react, their momentum slams into a brick wall. They begin to feel the empty space. They begin to doubt their own leverage. I watched the micro-expressions shift around the table. Sterling's patronizing smile slowly faded into a confused, tight line. The junior partner shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, clearing his throat. Chloe stopped her performative crying, lowering the tissue to glare at me with genuine simmering irritation. David's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck jumped. He hated losing control of an audience. He hated being ignored. Sarah Sterling finally snapped his smooth tone, cracking with sudden annoyance. "I strongly advise you to take this offer. We are not here to waste billable hours staring at each other. If you do not sign that document right now, we are filing the federal injunctions this afternoon." I slowly unclasped my hands. I reached down to the floor. I picked up my structured leather briefcase and set it on the mahogany table. The brass locks clicked loudly in the quiet room. I pulled out the heavy navy blue 3-ring binder. I dropped it onto the glass center of the table. The heavy thud echoed off the soundproof walls. It was the sound of a 10-year illusion coming to a violent permanent end. I did not look at the lawyers. I looked directly at my husband. "I do not need alimony, David," I said. My voice was clinically precise. It was the exact tone I use when I sit across from corporate embezzlers during a federal audit. I do not need the equity in the house, because as of Tuesday morning, neither of those things actually exist. David frowned. His eyes darted to the blue binder. "What are you talking about?" I opened the binder to the first red tab. I pulled out the certified county-stamped commercial lien documents. I slid them across the polished wood, stopping them right on top of his ridiculous fabricated confession. "I recommend you look closely at the signature page," I instructed. Sterling snatched the document before David could reach it. The lawyer's eyes scanned the heavy paper. I watched his pupils track back and forth. I watched him find the raised county notary seal. I watched him see the $3 million figure printed clearly at the top of the commercial agreement. "Your client did not lose $150,000 to a clerical error," I said, addressing Sterling directly. "Your client is the victim of a coordinated multi-million-dollar wire fraud scheme. 3 weeks ago, a revolving line of credit was secured against his 3 primary distribution warehouses. The funds were immediately authorized and transferred." I flipped to the second red tab. I slid the Delaware Shell Company Incorporation records across the table, followed immediately by the offshore IP routing logs. The money was moved from the commercial equity line directly into the company's operating account. I continued. My words fell like hammer strikes, steady, rhythmic, undeniable. From there, it was wired in highly structured batches to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The sole managing director of that shell company is Thomas Miller, your brother David. David's face went completely slack. He stared at the documents scattered across the table. He looked at the forged signature on the commercial lien. He saw his own name written in ink, legally binding his entire empire to a massive debt he knew absolutely nothing about. "The secondary authorizing signature on the internal wire transfers," I said, turning my gaze to the girl sitting in the pink cashmere sweater, "belongs to Chloe." The rising panic in the room was instantaneous. Chloe completely dropped the innocent victim act. The sweet weeping daughter vanished. Her face twisted into a mask of pure vicious panic. She slammed both hands onto the mahogany table and shot out of her chair. "She is lying!" Chloe screamed. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing harshly against the glass walls. "She fabricated those documents. She is just a bitter, jealous bitch trying to ruin my life because you threw her out. Dad, do not listen to her. She is faking the bank records." She pointed a shaking finger at me. I did not react. I simply watched her unravel. Sterling did not join in her screaming. The high-priced aggressive corporate lawyer had gone entirely completely dead silent. He was staring at the certified county stamps on the commercial lien. He was staring at the Delaware Incorporation filings. He was a professional. He knew exactly what a certified public record looked like. He knew that you cannot fake a raised municipal notary seal. More importantly, Sterling realized exactly what he had just done. He had just formally on the record attempted to extort a licensed federal auditor into signing a false confession to cover up a multi-million-dollar bank fraud. He had inadvertently walked himself into a massive federal conspiracy. Sterling slowly lowered the document to the table. He did not look at David. He did not look at Chloe. He looked at the junior partner sitting next to him, and the pure, unadulterated dread passing between the two lawyers was absolute. David looked like he could not breathe. He was staring at the papers, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. He looked at the $3 million debt. He looked at his brother's name. Then he looked at his daughter, who was still standing still, screaming that I was a liar, still demanding that her father destroy me. She did not just steal $150,000 to cover a bad investment. "David," I said quietly, cutting cleanly through Chloe's hysterical shouting. "That was just the test transaction. She did not just take your cash. She stole your entire legacy." The performance was over. The trap had snapped shut, and David was finally brutally awake. The air in the conference room grew incredibly thin. Sterling was frozen, his expensive silver pen suspended exactly halfway between his leather-bound notepad and the polished mahogany table. Chloe had stopped her hysterical shouting. She was panting heavily, looking wildly between her father and the damning pile of certified bank records. I did not give them a single second to regroup or formulate a defense. I reached out and flipped the heavy plastic divider to the third and final red tab. I pulled a thick stack of printed text message transcripts from the clear sheet protectors. The paper was bright, stark white under the harsh fluorescent lights of the law firm. I bypassed the aggressive defense lawyers completely. I slid the thick stack directly across the glass center of the table until it gently bumped against David's folded hands. "Read them, David." My voice was perfectly flat, lacking any trace of the anger or vindictiveness he likely expected. "Read exactly what your daughter thinks of your unwavering loyalty." David looked down at the top page. He did not want to read it. I could see the desperate primal instinct of a father trying to shield his own heart from a truth he could no longer outrun. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown dark and absolute against the bright overhead lights. But the text was printed in a large, clean font. It was impossible to ignore. I watched his eyes track slowly across the first line. The message was sent from Chloe to Thomas on a Tuesday afternoon, right around the exact time David had been standing in our kitchen yelling at me for spending too much money on household groceries. Chloe had typed out a long, detailed complaint about her mounting credit card debts. Thomas had responded 2 minutes later. He told her not to worry about the balances, because the gullible old man would happily take the fall while they cashed out the commercial equity. David read the next line. Chloe had replied with a laughing emoji. She typed that her father was too busy playing the tough corporate boss to ever check the actual capital asset ledgers. She called him a clueless ATM. She joked about how incredibly easily she could forge his signature because he never bothered to lock the heavy oak doors of his home office. I watched the exact moment my husband's entire reality fractured. It was a terrifying physical transformation. The color drained from his face so rapidly that his skin took on the waxy, translucent hue of tracing paper. His broad shoulders, which he had held so rigidly defensive since I walked into the room, suddenly caved inward. His hands began to tremble. A fine, violent tremor started in his fingertips and traveled up his forearms, shaking the crisp cuffs of his tailored shirt. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. His lucrative medical supply business was leveraged to the absolute limit. The $3 million commercial lien was a ticking time bomb buried in his own foundation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would inevitably flag the fraudulent loan the moment the monthly payments defaulted. He was staring directly down the barrel of federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and utter financial ruin. And the absolute worst part, the part that was actively tearing his soul apart in real time, was the knowledge of what he had done to me. He had thrown his loyal, innocent wife out of their home in the middle of a rainstorm. He had coldly handed me divorce papers. He had demanded I commit federal perjury and risk my own freedom. He had done all of it to protect a daughter who was actively, gleefully framing him for a massive federal crime. Chloe watched her father read the pages. She saw his hands shaking violently against the wood. She saw the absolute soul-crushing devastation blooming across his face. And in that precise moment, the sweet, weeping, victimized girl completely vanished. Seeing that the game was entirely up, Chloe turned on him instantly. The speed of her betrayal was breathtaking. "It is your fault!" she screamed. Her voice was shrill and jagged, echoing violently off the soundproof glass walls of the conference room. She slammed both of her hands flat on the table, leaning aggressively toward the man who had shielded her from every single consequence of her life. "You never gave me enough money!" she yelled, her face twisting into a mask of pure, vicious entitlement. "You always made me ask for it. You made me feel like a beggar in my own family. Thomas said we deserved it. Thomas said you were hoarding the company profits and freezing us out. You brought this on yourself." She did not show a single ounce of remorse. She did not apologize for the impending federal investigation or the total loss of his legacy. She blamed him for being an easy target. She blamed him for trusting her. She weaponized his unconditional love and used it to justify her theft. David just stared at her. He could not form words. His mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling breath came out. He looked at the screaming, venomous young woman standing across from him and realized he did not know her at all. He had created a monster by protecting her from the world, and that monster had just eaten him alive in front of an audience. Chloe did not wait for a response. She grabbed her designer purse from the floor with a sharp, angry motion. She shot one final venomous glare at me, her eyes filled with undisguised burning hatred. She spun on her heel and stormed toward the exit. Her heavy boots slammed against the hardwood border of the room. She yanked the heavy glass door open and marched out into the marble corridor. The door swung shut behind her with a heavy pressurized seal, leaving a deafening, crushing silence in her wake. David was left completely, utterly alone at the head of the table. The sheer velocity of Chloe's exit left the room feeling strangely vacuum-sealed. The air conditioning hummed a low mechanical note from the ceiling vents. Sterling and the junior partner sat perfectly frozen in their ergonomic chairs. They had been hired to execute a routine divorce settlement and perhaps bully a discarded spouse into a quiet submission. They had not signed up to witness a multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy detonate in real time. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table. I did not smile. I did not offer any commentary. The papers resting in front of David told the entire story. There was absolutely nothing left for me to say. I just let the crushing, inescapable gravity of the truth press down on every single person in the room. Sterling was the first to break the paralysis. The lead defense attorney suddenly realized the profound legal jeopardy of his current position. He had formally presented a fabricated confession document to a licensed forensic auditor. He had explicitly threatened financial ruin to conceal a felony. The ethical and criminal implications for his law firm were catastrophic. He cleared his throat. The sound was rough and incredibly unnatural. He stood up very quickly, gathering his leather notepad and his expensive silver pen with frantic, uncoordinated movements. Mr. Miller Sterling, said, his voice stripped entirely of its previous arrogance and polish. I need to make an immediate phone call to my managing partners. We must advise you that our firm may no longer be able to represent you in this matter, given the nature of the documentation presented today. David did not look up. He did not acknowledge the lawyer at all. He just kept staring blindly at the printed text messages, his eyes locked on the laughing emoji his daughter had sent. Sterling did not wait for a formal dismissal. He gestured sharply to the junior partner. Both men practically sprinted toward the glass door. They did not look at me as they left. They vanished down the long, brightly lit marble corridor, desperately fleeing the blast radius of David's collapsed empire. The heavy glass door clicked shut once more. Rachel, my attorney, sat quietly beside me. She closed her sleek silver briefcase and gave me a very small, very professional nod. She understood her job here was done. She respectfully pushed her chair back, gathered her wool coat, and slipped out of the room, leaving me completely alone with my husband. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It stretched across the polished mahogany, filling the massive empty conference room with the ghosts of our 10-year marriage. David slowly lifted his shaking hands from the table. He brought them up to his face, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. The sound was ragged, tearing its way up from the very bottom of his chest. Then his stoic, arrogant facade shattered entirely. The proud man who had confidently marched through life expecting total obedience. The man who had coldly packed my bags and thrown me out into a freezing rainstorm just weeks ago broke down completely. He began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified crying. It was an agonizing, chest-heaving sob that physically shook his entire frame. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders convulsing with the sheer, crushing weight of his reality. He wept for the daughter who had thoroughly despised him. He wept for the brother who had gleefully betrayed him. He wept for the massive, lucrative company he had built from the ground up, a company that was now hopelessly leveraged and doomed to federal seizure. The sound of his grief was guttural and raw. It was the terrible, unguarded sound of a human being realizing that every single choice he had made was completely, fundamentally wrong. I sat across from him and watched him break. For weeks, while I sat in my isolated, paint-smelling apartment hunting through complex digital ledgers, I had imagined this exact moment. I had envisioned the look of sheer terror on his face when the trap finally snapped shut. I had anticipated feeling a profound, sweeping sense of victory. I thought I would feel entirely vindicated. I thought I would feel the cold, satisfying thrill of perfect revenge. But as I watched my husband gasping for air between agonizing sobs, the triumphant satisfaction never arrived. I looked at his graying hair. I looked at the way his expensive navy suit hung on his shrinking frame. I remembered the man who used to make me black coffee on quiet Sunday mornings, the man who had promised to build a safe, stable life with me. That man had been swallowed whole by his own blind loyalty to a daughter who viewed him as nothing more than an expendable resource. My deep, burning resentment, the anger that had fueled my meticulous forensic hunt, simply melted away. It dissolved into the cold, sterile air of the downtown law firm. What replaced it was something much heavier. It was an unexpected, devastating empathy. I did not feel sorry for the arrogant boss who demanded I commit perjury. I did not forgive the cruel husband who had tried to leave me destitute. But looking across the table, I felt a profound, heartbreaking pity for the father who had just realized his child was a monster. I felt a terrible, heavy sorrow for the man who had thrown away the only person who actually cared about his well-being, all to protect a family that was actively plotting his destruction. He was completely broken. He was functionally bankrupt. He was facing the very real possibility of federal prison time. He had absolutely no one left in the world. His sobs echoed off of the soundproof glass, bouncing back at us, trapping the raw grief inside the room. I did not cross the wide carpet to comfort him. I did not reach out to touch his shaking shoulder. The damage between us was far too deep, the betrayal far too absolute for empty physical gestures. But I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice to demand an apology he was no longer capable of giving. I just sat in my ergonomic chair perfectly still and let him mourn the death of his entire life. I watched the ruins of our marriage settle on the glass table between us, buried permanently under certified bank records and printed lies. The burning anger was entirely gone, leaving only the quiet, factual reality of what he had lost. The sound of a grown man sobbing is an incredibly heavy thing. It fills a room and presses against the walls. David sat with his face buried in his hands. His expensive suit jacket bunched awkwardly around his shaking shoulders. 10 minutes ago, he was a titan of industry preparing to crush a disobedient wife. Now he was just a broken shell of a man realizing he had funded his own destruction. I watched him cry. I did not feel the urge to mock him. I did not feel the need to stand over him and scream that I was right all along. Vindication is a funny thing. You spend weeks hunting for it. You dig through ledgers and public records hoping that when you finally expose the truth, it will feel like a celebration. It does not. It just feels like closing a ledger. The numbers balance. The deficit is accounted for. There is no joy in the final tally. There is only clarity. I placed my hand flat against the cool glass of the conference table. I looked at the man who had ordered me to commit a federal crime. I looked at the man who had packed my bags and exiled me into a rainstorm. I could have stood up right then, taken my briefcase, and walked out the door. I could have let the federal banking regulators discover the fraudulent commercial lien on their own timeline. If I had done nothing at all, the bank would have inevitably seized his entire medical supply distribution network. The authorities would have arrested him alongside his daughter and his brother. But I am not a vindictive person. I am a compliance auditor. I solve discrepancies. And despite everything David had done to me, I was not going to watch a man go to federal prison for a crime he did not commit. I reached out and pulled the heavy navy blue binder back across the table. The metal rings clinked softly as I opened it to the very last section. There was no red tab for this page. It was tucked into a clear plastic sleeve at the absolute back of the collection. I pulled out a crisp, pre-filled form. It was a formal safe harbor compliance disclosure document designed specifically for the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I slid the paper across the polished mahogany until it rested exactly in front of his folded arms. David slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot and completely hollow. His face was damp with tears. He looked at the document blankly, unable to comprehend what he was seeing through his grief. I kept my voice perfectly level. I spoke to him not as a discarded wife, but as the senior financial officer he desperately needed. In the banking world, David, the person who reports the fraud first, is the one who controls the narrative. If the bank discovers that forged commercial lien during a routine portfolio review, they will immediately classify you as a willing participant. They will assume you orchestrated the $3 million loan to hide your own failing margins. The federal prosecutors will not care about your family dynamics. They will only look at the ink on the signature line. David stared at the paper. His hands were trembling so violently he could not even pick it up. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. However, I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. If you submit this safe harbor disclosure today, you change the classification. You officially notify the federal regulators that your identity was stolen and your commercial assets were leveraged without your consent. It establishes a documented timeline of your innocence. It initiates a victim claim before they can issue a criminal indictment. He looked up at me. The absolute awe in his expression was completely undisguised. He was looking at a woman he had thrown away like garbage, realizing she had spent her final hours in his life building him a lifeline. This document will not save your fortune, David. I delivered the hard truth with absolute precision. The bank will still call the loan. You will have to liquidate your commercial warehouses to cover the fraudulent debt. Your medical supply company will be completely dismantled by the creditors. You are going to lose your entire empire. But if you sign this piece of paper today, you will keep your freedom. It will keep you out of a federal cell. I reached into my bag and pulled out my favorite silver pen. I laid it gently on top of the disclosure form. The metallic click echoed in the silent room. You chose her, David. I said the words clearly, letting them hang in the cold air of the conference room. And she chose to destroy you. Sign this today and you stay out of a cell. I stood up. I pushed my ergonomic chair back and picked up my leather briefcase. I looked down at him one last time. This is the last piece of paperwork I will ever do for you. David did not try to argue. He did not offer empty apologies. He picked up the silver pen with a shaking hand. He looked at me with a mixture of sheer awe, profound regret, and a tear-filled gratitude that he completely lacked the vocabulary to express. He realized in that exact moment the staggering magnitude of the grace he was receiving. I turned away before he signed his name. I walked out of the glass conference room, down the marble corridor, and stepped into the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. I did not look back. The aftermath of a collapsed empire is never quick. It is a slow, methodical grinding of gears. Over the next 18 months, the reality of the $3 million fraud rippled through the federal court system. I watched it happen from a very safe, very comfortable distance. Because David had filed the safe harbor disclosure on that exact Friday afternoon, the federal investigators immediately shifted their focus away from him. They subpoenaed the transaction records from the Delaware Limited Liability Company. They seized the offshore accounts. It did not take a forensic genius to track the stolen money once the authorities knew exactly where to look. Uncle Thomas and Chloe were formally indicted for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The loyalty between thieves evaporates the moment the handcuffs appear. Thomas immediately attempted to turn state evidence against his niece, claiming she was the mastermind who had abused her administrative access. Chloe retaliated by providing prosecutors with text messages, proving Thomas had orchestrated the commercial lien. They completely destroyed each other in open court. They both received substantial federal prison sentences. There were no more luxury vehicles. There were no more paid-off college deans. There was only the harsh, undeniable reality of consequences. David avoided criminal prosecution entirely. The disclosure document I provided had done its exact job. It proved he was the victim of a sophisticated family betrayal. But avoiding prison did not mean avoiding the financial ruin he had invited into his life. The major commercial bank immediately called the fraudulent loan. To satisfy the massive $3 million debt, David was forced into total liquidation. He had to sell his 3 pristine distribution warehouses. He had to dissolve the lucrative medical supply company he had spent 2 decades building. His sprawling estate was sold to a corporate developer. The luxury cars were repossessed. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that David eventually moved into a small, unremarkable apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. He took a mid-level management job at a regional shipping firm. He goes to work. He goes home to his quiet rented box. He is a profoundly humbled, permanently changed man who must wake up every single day and live with the catastrophic choices he made. He threw away a loyal partner to protect a parasite, and he paid the ultimate price for his blindness. My path went in an entirely different direction. 3 months after I walked out of that downtown law firm, the regional bank I worked for completely restructured its compliance division. The executive board recognized my exceptional threshold for detail and my unwavering commitment to federal regulations. I was formally promoted to the position of Director of Compliance. The salary increase was substantial. The corner office was a nice touch, but the real reward was the profound sense of stability I had built for myself. I purchased my own townhouse in a quiet, beautiful neighborhood lined with old oak trees. It has high ceilings and a massive kitchen island, where I drink my black coffee every morning in total, uninterrupted peace. There is no one demanding my free labor. There is no one hiding secrets in the family ledgers. I am thriving. I am completely unbothered. I am entirely free from the toxic family dynamics that define my 30s. People often assume that justice requires a massive theatrical confrontation. They think you have to scream your pain into the void to be heard. They believe you have to actively destroy the people who hurt you in order to heal. But my life has taught me something fundamentally different. Revenge is loud. It requires energy. It requires you to stay engaged with the very people who do not deserve a single second of your time. True power is perfectly quiet. True power is knowing your own worth and refusing to negotiate it. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who betrayed you is simply hand them a mirror to show them exactly what they are. And then you turn around and walk away. You let them burn in the fire they built with their own 2 hands. If this story reminded you of the absolute power of walking away with your dignity intact, please share it with someone who genuinely needs to hear it today. Remind them that silence is not surrender. It is strategy. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. I will see you in the next one.